I'm Sydney Krawiec.
And I'm Nancy Martin.
And today we are here at Brush Run Cemetery. Brush Run Cemetery is run by the Brush Run Cemetery Association, and it is located at the intersection of Brush Run and Brookwood Roads, across from the Peters Creek Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and it's one of the older cemeteries in the township. In June of 2025, we hosted some walkthrough tours of the cemetery where we strolled and shared some information about the cemetery and people who were buried here. This recording is to help share that information with the community and individuals who may not have been able to join us for those walks. So we've researched the information we were sharing, but there's undoubtedly a lot more out there. The church that oversaw the cemetery until the 1900s shared with us that some of their earlier records were destroyed in a fire. So what we have today that we're sharing is from genealogic and cemetery research and was supplemented with some information from the church. So during the walk, we're going to stop and look at some iconography, some epitaphs, weathering, and talk about some historical and local connections of some of the people buried here. Prior to being called Brush Run Cemetery, this was Peters Creek Cemetery, or Old Peters Creek Cemetery, is what it was called prior to 1905. This site became the church and cemetery in 1795. Previously, the church was situated on Daniel Dara's farm near Venetia and Mingo Creek, and the church was either referred to as Peters Creek or Mingo Creek. Reverend Matthew Henderson, a Scottish missionary who came to Pennsylvania in 1775, was the preacher for the church, as well as the Chartiers and Buffalo churches. His unexpected death in 1795 caused the church members to elect elders and take votes to set down more permanent roots in the community. 2 acres were purchased here from James Mitchell, one of those elders, for $10, an equivalent of $378 today. So this is where we are now. 1 acre was fenced in for the graveyard, and the other acre had a temporary tent while a log cabin was constructed. Graves were dug at random and people could be buried free of charge. The church became known as Peters Creek United Presbyterian Church, and the first recorded burial dates back to 1800, according to the church's historical book. Now, this wasn't the only Peters Creek Cemetery. There's also the Peters Creek Baptist Church Cemetery at Churchill in 88, with their oldest death recorded at 1760. There's the Peters Creek Christian Church Cemetery at Sugar Camp in Churchill, with their oldest date as 1859. And if you go all the way to Clairton, there's also a Peters Creek Cemetery there. The church history book takes you through the founding of the church, the building of this 1832 structure behind us, and the many changes in pastors through the years. The book is called A History of Christian Service through the Peters Creek United Presbyterian Congregation, 1795 to 1970, and it's available to view online at PA Photos and Docs. The church also made us a copy of their 1895 A History of the Associate, now United Presbyterian Congregation of Peters Creek Church. And these 2 books help to supplement our general knowledge of the history of the cemetery.
This is the grave of Sarah Bryant. Sarah was born Sarah McGill in Ireland around 1770. She married William Bryant in 1790 and passed away a year before him in 1849 at the age of 78. Together, they had 10 children. The reason I wanted to discuss this stone is because you notice the black streaks that are on it. So there are different types of weathering that affect gravestones, and one of them is chemical weathering, which takes place when there's a reaction between the environment and the stone itself. So this black streaking is most likely the result of air pollution, in which sulfur dioxide and other airborne chemicals have mixed with the minerals in this stone. You can also see on Sarah's grave the draping and the tassels. That's a form of iconography, and it represents the Victoria-era custom of covering the visitation rooms of homes or funeral parlors in decorative heavy black cloth. They're meant to bring to mind a shroud which would have been placed over the body, a sign of loss and mourning. So here's are the graves of Hans and Nancy Dunlop, and a stroll through a cemetery is a very powerful reminder of the high rates of childhood mortality in the past. So here we have Hans and Nancy and the graves of 6 of their 9 children. So between 1828 and 1848, Hans and Nancy Dunlop had 9 children together: Lydia, William, James, Lavinia, Margaret, John, David, Nancy, and Louis. Louis was born in 1848 when Nancy was 44 or 45 years old. Sadly, contagious diseases clearly played a role in the child's deaths. 2 of the children, William and Lydia, aged 1 and 2, died in May of 1831, and 3 children, John, Lavinia, and James, died in June of 1840. Possible diseases include cholera, which is an infection of the intestines, scarlet fever, or tuberculosis. It's interesting to note that every day of a life was celebrated when people didn't live as long as they did now. It's very common to see the years, months, and even days of life etched into a gravestone here. For example, we have James Thomas Dunlop, aged 8 years, 11 months, and 8 days. Lewis, the Dunlop's last child, lived into adulthood before being killed at the age of 28, and his grave can be seen here to the other side of his parents. None of the 3 children who lived into adulthood, Margaret, David, or Nancy, are actually buried here at Brush Run. Thankfully, it wasn't all bad news for the Dunlops. Their one child, Margaret, known locally as Miss Maggie, was a milliner who made and sold ladies' hats. She lived to be 90 years of age, and at the time of her death in 1924, the Washington Observer newspaper wrote that she was probably the oldest resident of Canonsburg. The 3 tombstones here in front of me all bear weeping willow iconography. Iconography being the decorative carvings often found on the tombstones. It's interesting for me to note that there are 3 depictions of weeping willows, but no 2 are the same. All 3 are distinct. And the weeping willow, its drooping branches were to symbolize the low spirits, sadness, and grief of the family of the deceased. I mentioned earlier that there are 3 different types of weathering of gravestones. The first type that we already discussed when we talked about Sarah Bryant's grave was chemical weathering. Here we have examples of physical weathering, which includes the expansion-contraction weathering and freeze-thaw weathering. Wind can also play a role, blowing away small particles of the graves. Physical weathering can cause fragments of stone to detach from the surface of the tombstone. And it's especially noticeable on sandstone markers and is referred to as spalling. And an example of that can be seen right here. The impact of the freezing and thawing can be seen on this grave here, which has quite a large crack down the middle of the face of the stone. A third type of weathering is biological weathering. And it's damage done as a result of plant life. And it is plants that attach themselves to gravestones actually take nutrients out of the stone, such as calcium. And the attachment points of moss and lichen, as can be seen on this grave, are called rhizoids, and they anchor the plant and enable the absorption of water and minerals. It's interesting to note that there's even an index that people use to assess the level of weathering on stones. It's called Rahn's Index, R-A-H-N, and stone with carving in it can be assessed at levels 1 through 6. 1 meaning the lettering is sharp and distinct with no evidence of change, and 6 basically means what lettering? There's nothing left. Another example of gravestone iconography that can be seen at Brush Run Cemetery is here on the graves of David and Martha Moore, and that is the clasped hands, which are saying farewell to one another with the agreement to see each other again someday in heaven.
Over here we have Adam and Elizabeth Galt. Adam was a church elder. He was elected in 1796 when they moved to the area and the church continued to expand. He's actually from Somerset originally. He was born there in 1714, an original Pennsylvania kid, if you will. He moved to the area and then married Elizabeth around 1790, and then he passed away here in 1812. What's interesting to note is that Elizabeth Stone, even though she passed away 13 years after her husband, is so much more severely spalled and deteriorated than his over here.
Sid and I were surprised to see the word consort appear on a number of gravestones where we would have expected to see the word wife or husband. It turns out after doing some research that a consort was someone who outlived their husband or wife, so a widow or a widower. The term relict, R-E-L-I-C-T, was another term that might have been used instead of consort.
So over there we have Jane Sweeney, consort of Alexander Sweeney. We wanted to mention Alexander Sweeney because the oldest document in the Peters Township Public Library archives names him. We have an enumeration of the taxable inhabitants with the slaves of Peters Township in the year 1800. In 1800, there were 2 slave owners in Peters Township and 2 slaves total. Daniel Townsend reported owning a man named Boot, and Alexander Sweeney had a female slave named Violet. Now, if you're a Pennsylvania state history buff, you may know that the state passed the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in 1780. As the name indicates, it did not free people immediately, but created a gradual release for all enslaved peoples. It required for all enslaved people born in the state to be freed when they turned 28 years old. The state kept records, and in 1800, there were a total of 1,706 slaves across the state of Pennsylvania. That number gradually declined until slavery was completely abolished in the state in 1850. In the 1810 census, Alexander Sweeney did not report any slaves, and we are unsure of what happened to Violet. And over here we have John Sweeney. John Sweeney was a Revolutionary War veteran. Whenever you visit cemeteries, and if you visit Brush Run or as we continue to walk around, you'll note these flags with emblems down here. These are put out by the Brush Run Cemetery, and the emblems denote which war they were a veteran of. So John Sweeney here was Revolutionary War. You'll also see Civil War, War of 1812, World War I, World War II, Korean, and Vietnam here at Brush Run. As you go around, you may see GAR, and that stands for Grand Army of the Republic. That's the large veteran organization that came about for Union soldiers after the Civil War. So GAR is representative of someone who served the Union forces in the Civil War.
Epitaphs are short inscriptions, often poems or phrases written on gravestones to honor the deceased. The Callahan tombstones seen here bear beautiful epitaphs, which would have been costly to have carved, but be forewarned that childhood mortality rears its ugly head here again. The gravestone second from left, seen here, is for Daniel Callahan, aged 1 year and 21 days. And the epitaph seen on it is lines of poetry from Lord Byron's Epitaph on a Beloved Friend. And it reads, "No marble marks thy couch of lowly sleep, but living statues there are seen to weep. Affliction's semblance bands not o'er thy tomb, affliction self deplores thy youthful doom." The gravestone fourth from the left is for Jane Callahan, and I'm saying it like that because it's interesting to note how many times names within a single family are spelled differently, and that would have been due to errors made on the part of the engravers of the stones. So Callahan, spelled Calohhan here. She was aged 7 years, 9 months, and 4 days, and the clarity of writing on this stone from 1833 I think is remarkable. Her epitaph reads, "O death, thou hast conquered me. I by thy dart am slain. But Christ the Lord hath conquered thee, and I will rise again." And apparently this was an often used bit of verse found on tombstones of the time, so the 1830s. And then the final gravestone here is for another Jane Callahan, aged 1 year, and it includes lines from a hymn that read, "No more the pleasant child is seen to please its parent's eye. The tender plant, so fresh and green, is in eternity." So this is the gravestone of James and Mary Crouch. James passed away when he was 54 years old from pneumonia. He was a Civil War veteran who enlisted when he was 18 years old. He settled in the area and married Mary Isabel McMurray, who outlived him by 36 years. You'll see that this stone is decorated with acanthus leaves and columns. The acanthus leaf symbolizes rebirth, immortality, and the heavenly garden, while the regular or complete columns represent the completion of a noble life. A broken column would signify an early death. As we walk through the cemetery, you'll notice that we have a mix here of both words carved into the stone and words that protrude from the stone, which stand out in relief. And you can see that the Crouch's grave is an example of relief. On the gravestone of Jane C. Pierce, located beneath the large word sister, you can see the words G, Sons, and Company inscribed into the stone. The Monongahela Granite and Marble Works was established in Monongahela City in 1852 by R.M. G. In 1865, Mr. G took his 4 sons into the business and changed its name to R.M.G. Sons and Company. The firm's business was the manufacturing of marble and granite monuments and headstones, and the business was lucky enough to own a sandstone quarry about a mile from town. In 1907, Monongahela Councilman William Isaac purchased the business from Emma G., the widow of R.M.'s last living son Samuel, and moved it to the corner of, appropriately, Main and Cemetery Streets. An advertisement for R.M.G.'s son's marble works in the Monongahela Valley Republican newspaper in 1905 boasted, "We have the very latest appliances and the most skillful workmen, all lettering done in the latest approved manner, not by the old-time hand method."
Looking down the hill, we can see how the cemetery has expanded past its original 1 acre that was fenced in by the church in 1795. That single acre held 145 lots, causing the church to seek additional land. The cemetery was expanded with land bought from James and Sarah Wright, who deeded it to Harvey/Hervey McMurray, John Wilson, Thomas Wilson, and their successors. By 1895, there are 500 graves in the small area, but plans for a new railroad threatened the space. The church made plans themselves and filed paperwork to create the Brush Run Cemetery Incorporated, which helped establish the legal precedent for protecting this land. The railroad was built just up the road and is what we know now as the Montour Trail. So we're currently in Venetia, and across the road is McMurray, and right here we have some more McMurrays. We have James McMurray and Isabella Ballantyne McMurray. They independently to the United States from Ireland. They met here, married, and settled on a farm in Allegheny County, where they had 14 children between 1813 and 1830-ish. 12 of those 14 children are buried here in Brush Run. And of those 14 children, 11 did make it to adulthood, and there are at least 6 generations of McMurrays buried here in Brush Run Cemetery. So this tall spire marks James and Isabella's graves, as well as that of an infant daughter, infant son, and Andrew, who passed away when he was 4 or 5. To the right are 4 more of their children, James, Esther, Edward, and Margaret. Sometime in the 1850s, William, Andrew, Edward, and Harvey McMurray moved to the area. Hervey, who also went by Harvey, and his brother William married a pair of sisters, Jane and Emily Mock. The McMurray brothers and their descendants went on to establish several prominent businesses in the area, including a flour mill, grocery store, cooperative dairy, the McMurray Barbecue and Service Station, and the McMurray Telephone Company.
I wanted to discuss the iconography on the gravestones of Andrew and Mary Borland. So at the top of both graves, you can see an urn with wheat coming out of the top. The urn symbolizes death itself. The Greeks used the urn as a symbol of mourning, since it was often used as a container for the ashes of the deceased. The wheat seen coming up out of the urn symbolized a long life, a life harvested at the correct time. The Borlands both lived long lives, both of them passing away at the age of 82. So I also wanted to discuss the iconography on some of the Douglas stones, Douglas with 2 S's. The hand with the finger pointing up symbolizes the soul's ascension into heaven. And on the grave of Mary L. Douglas, the hand, while pointing up, is also holding a lily, which symbolizes purity and innocence. Birds symbolize that the spirit has left the body, transcendence and freedom. A bird with an olive branch in its beak, such as is in the case on the grave of Carolyn Douglas, symbolizes a soul that has reached divine peace in heaven. The lily represents resurrection and the innocence of the soul, and the rose symbolizes love, hope, and beauty.
In 1891, the church lost 3 prominent members in the same week, although all were due to advanced age. Thomas Douglas died on Tuesday, April 14th at age 88. Richard Patterson, who was uncle of the Reverend at the time, passed on Friday, April 17th at age 91. And William Wright here died on Monday, April 21st in the 82nd year of his life. Now, William Wright and Thomas Douglas were brothers-in-law, and with Thomas marrying William's sister, and one of Thomas's daughters also married one of Richard's sons. So not only were these 3 deaths felt within the church community, but also by their families threefold. James Mitchell was born September 15, 1750 in Londonderry, Ireland, and served in the Revolutionary War as a sergeant major from the spring of 1776 to October of 1781. You can view his Revolutionary War pension and bounty land warrant application with the National Archives available online. We also already mentioned him, as it was his sale of the original 2 acres here that made the church and cemetery possible. He died on January 19, 1841.
William Boyd Phillips has a grave here commemorating his life, but he's not actually buried here. As you can see, his stone says buried in France. Phillips was a 1914 graduate of Peters Township High School who was killed while serving overseas in World War I. He died on September 28, 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, a part of the final Allied offensive of World War I. It helped bring an end to the war and was fought from September 26th until November 11th, when the armistice was signed. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the largest operation of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, with over 1 million American soldiers participating. It was also the deadliest campaign in American history, resulting in over 26,000 soldiers being killed in action and over 120,000 total casualties. There was a memorial stone for Phillips at the old Peters Township High School that was once located where the intermediate unit now stands on East McMurray Road. There was concern that this stone had been bulldozed under when that high school was torn down. It was then rediscovered outside of the Peters Township Public Works garage in 2002 and moved to Peters Township Council chambers. William's sacrifice, along with those of others Peters Township's residents, is now memorialized on the monument outside of the township building. Finally, we come to the Townsends. Here we have the graves of William, a farmer, and his wife, Mary. To the right of their grave is a remarkable tombstone, which is for their daughter, Helen Wright Townsend, who was born in 1896 and died August 16, 1897, when she was less than a year old. The open book that you can see here symbolizes a life story not fully written. On the pages of the open book are written the words Mama's Darling and Papa's Pet. The tree stump which supports the book symbolizes a life cut short. Happily, the Townsends had another daughter named Nan, who was born on March 31st, 1897, and lived to the age of 71. She too is buried here in Brush Run Cemetery. Nan taught in Peters Township schools for 10 years and married Joseph McMurray in 1918. Together they had 2 sons, James and William McMurray, both of whom served in World War II. William is buried here in Brush Run and James is buried in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The local history room in which the Peters Township Public Library Archives is located is called the James D. and William C. McMurray Local History Room. So William and Mary are the great-grandparents of Marcia and Susan McMurray, who donated money to the library in support of the archives, which is named after William and Mary's grandsons, James and William.
So in 1907, James Wright Patterson deeded a little over 3 acres to that newly incorporated Brush Run Cemetery Association, which encompasses the present-day cemetery. It's an active congregation and an active cemetery with burials taking place further up the hill from where we were today. So thank you again for spending your time with us, and we hope that you learned something new.